My son took my house, and for a long time, I blamed myself for letting it happen. I want you to imagine this clearly, because if you're listening right now, you might recognize pieces of your own life in mine. I stood in the doorway of the home I'd lived in for 32 years, holding a purse that suddenly felt too small for everything I was losing. My son didn't even look at me. He was scrolling on his phone while the locksmith changed the locks behind me. That sound, the click of metal turning, still echoes in my chest. If you've ever trusted someone just because you raised them, stay with me. This story isn't loud at first. It doesn't begin with shouting or slamming doors. It begins with silence, and with a signature I didn't fully understand. My name is Margaret. I'm 70 years old, widowed, and until recently, I believed family was the one thing that could never truly betray you. After my husband died, the house became too quiet. Too big. My son, Daniel, started visiting more often. He brought groceries, fixed small things, sat at the kitchen table, and told me I shouldn't be alone at my age. He said the world wasn't kind to elderly women anymore. I believed him because I wanted to. One evening, he laid some papers in front of me. He said it was just to help manage things, to protect the house if anything ever happened to me. I remember the way he smiled when he said, "Mom, this is for your own good." I didn't read every word. My eyes weren't as sharp as they used to be, and I trusted the boy I once held in my arms. I signed. If you're listening and thinking, I would never do that, I used to think that too. Things changed slowly. Daniel stopped asking before bringing people over. He spoke to me like I was a guest instead of the owner. One afternoon, he casually mentioned renovations. Another day, he told me I should start using the back bedroom because the front room would be better for the family. I laughed it off. Deep down, something felt wrong, but I told myself I was being dramatic. Then came the morning everything broke. Daniel showed up with a woman I didn't recognize and a man carrying tools. He told me I needed to leave for a few days. When I asked why, he actually sighed, and said, "Mom, don't make this hard." That was the first time he spoke to me like I was a problem. I asked him whose house he thought this was. He finally looked at me then, and his voice went cold. "It's not yours anymore." Right there, I felt something shift inside me. Not anger. Not yet. Something quieter. Something heavier. If you're listening, ask yourself this. What would you do if the child you sacrificed everything for decided you were no longer useful? Because what I did next shocked everyone. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I didn't collapse the way people expect an old woman to when her world is pulled out from under her. Instead, I asked one simple question. "What do you mean, it's not mine anymore?" Daniel didn't answer me directly. He nodded toward the woman beside him, who suddenly found the floor very interesting. The man with the tools cleared his throat. That's when Daniel said it. "You signed it over. The house is in my name now." Have you ever felt your stomach drop so fast it's like the ground disappeared? That's what it felt like. My hands went numb. I thought of those papers, the ones I signed without reading, the ones I trusted him with. I wanted to believe there was a misunderstanding. I wanted him to laugh and say it was a joke. But he didn't. Instead, he started listing reasons. He said I was forgetful. He said managing property was stressful. He said he and his wife needed stability for their future children. Not once did he say thank you. Not once did he acknowledge that this house was built with decades of sacrifice, night shifts, missed vacations, and a marriage that ended with me holding my husband's hand as he took his last breath in the very bedroom Daniel was now claiming. I packed a small bag. Just the essentials. A change of clothes, my medication, my wedding photo. Daniel told me he'd send money for a hotel. He didn't. I stayed with a friend for 3 nights, sleeping on a couch that smelled like someone else's detergent, staring at the ceiling and replaying every moment of trust I'd ever given him. Here's where I want you to lean in. Because this is the part people misunderstand. I wasn't planning revenge. I wasn't plotting. I wasn't angry in the way movies make anger look. I was stunned, hurt, and deeply embarrassed. There's a special kind of shame that comes with realizing your own child saw you as disposable. On the 4th day, I asked to come back for more of my things. Daniel agreed, but only if his wife was present. When I walked in, the house already felt different. My photos were gone. Furniture had been rearranged. It was like my life had been edited out. His wife watched me carefully, like I might steal something, as if everything there hadn't once been mine. That night, I sat alone again, holding that wooden box my husband had given me years ago. Inside were old documents I'd never had the heart to throw away. Deeds, letters, receipts. Things people assume are useless until they aren't. I hadn't looked inside in years. I almost didn't open it, but something told me to. And when I did, I realized something Daniel never expected. If you're listening, ask yourself this. How well do the people who wronged you really know your past? Because that box changed everything. The papers inside that box smelled like dust and time. My hands shook as I sorted through them, not from fear, but from memory. There were letters my husband wrote when he worked out of town, folded so many times the creases were soft. There were tax records, bank statements, and then something I had completely forgotten about. A second deed. Not for the house itself, but for the land behind it. A narrow strip most people didn't notice. A strip Daniel had never asked about. If you're listening closely, you already feel the shift. This wasn't about shouting or storming back into that house. This was about clarity. Years ago, my husband and I bought that land separately when the neighborhood was still half empty. The lawyer at the time insisted we keep it in my name only. Just in case, he said. I didn't question it. Life moved on. The land sat quietly and used, invisible. But now, with a single glance, I understood something important. The renovations Daniel planned? The expansion? The added driveway and extension? They all depended on that land. I didn't confront him right away. And this is important. When people think power looks like noise, they underestimate silence. I made a phone call instead. Then another. I spoke to a lawyer who listened carefully and didn't interrupt. When I finished, he said something that made me sit straighter. You're not as powerless as you think. For the first time in days, I slept. Over the next week, Daniel called me twice. His tone had softened. He asked if I was doing okay. He said maybe we could talk. I told him I needed time. If you've ever been hurt deeply, you know how strange it feels when the person who caused it suddenly wants peace. It's not kindness. It's discomfort. Then the city notice arrived. Daniel called me 12 times that afternoon. I didn't answer. When I finally did, his voice was tight, controlled. He asked if I knew anything about zoning restrictions. About easements. About permits being denied. I listened. I let the silence stretch just a little longer than comfortable. I might, I said. That's when he raised his voice. That's when he accused me of sabotaging him. He said I was bitter, ungrateful, that I was trying to punish him. I let him finish. Then I told him calmly that I hadn't done anything yet, that I simply owned something he needed, something he'd overlooked because he assumed I was finished. If you're listening, let me ask you something personal. Have you ever been dismissed so completely that someone forgot you existed until they needed you? The house was still in his name, but suddenly, the future he imagined inside it was on pause. And for the first time since that locksmith turned the key, I felt steady. This wasn't revenge. It was balance. Daniel showed up at my friend's house unannounced 2 days later. I watched him through the window before I opened the door, noticing how unfamiliar he suddenly looked. Not angry, not confident, just unsure. He asked if we could talk. I invited him in and offered tea, the same way I used to when he was a boy with scraped knees and broken toys. He declined. His hands kept moving, adjusting his jacket, rubbing his palms together. He didn't start with an apology. He started with frustration. He said the contractors were stuck, the city wouldn't approve permits, and money was bleeding out faster than expected. Then he finally asked, quietly, what I wanted. That question stayed between us for a moment. What did I want? I didn't want the house back. I didn't want to yell. I didn't want to win in the way people imagine winning. I wanted something deeper. I wanted acknowledgement. So I told him the truth. I told him how it felt to be erased from my own life. How humiliating it was to stand outside my home with a bag like I was the one who'd done something wrong. I told him I wasn't angry that he wanted security. I was angry that he took mine. He looked down then. really looked down. And for the first time, he said the words I hadn't realized I was waiting for. "I didn't think you'd need it anymore." That sentence hurt more than anything else. Because it wasn't cruel. It was careless. Here's where the shock came, the part people still talk about. I told him I would sign over the land. Every inch of it. But not for money. Not for leverage. On one condition only. That the house would be placed in a living trust with my name protected, my right to live there unquestioned, and my dignity restored on paper and in practice. He hesitated. Long enough for me to stand up and prepare to walk away. Then he agreed. We went to the lawyer together. He didn't speak much. I did. I asked questions. I made sure every clause was clear. When I signed, it wasn't blind trust this time. It was choice. I moved back into my home a week later. My room was untouched. My photos returned to the walls. Daniel's wife avoided my eyes at first, then slowly began to speak to me again. Things aren't perfect. They never are. But they're honest. If you're listening, here's what I want you to take from this. Power doesn't always look like taking something away. Sometimes it looks like knowing exactly what you're worth and refusing to disappear quietly. My son took my house. What I did next shocked everyone, not because it was loud, but because it reminded them that I was still here. And if you've ever felt overlooked, remember this. Silence doesn't mean weakness. Sometimes, it's where strength waits. Moving back into the house felt strange at first, like stepping into a memory that had been rearranged. The walls were the same color, the floors still creaked in the same places, but something fundamental had changed. I wasn't living there because someone allowed me to anymore. I was there because my place had been restored. And that difference settles deep in your bones. Daniel tried harder after that. Too hard, sometimes. He asked if I needed anything, if I was comfortable, if I wanted changes made. His voice carried something new, uncertainty. Not fear, exactly, but awareness. The kind that comes when you realize the person you underestimated is still very much alive. If you're listening, here's something important. Justice doesn't always arrive with apologies and hugs. Sometimes it arrives as respect forced into existence. People in the family began to notice the shift. At Sunday dinners, Daniel no longer spoke over me. When conversations turned to finances or plans, he included me. Not because I demanded it, but because excluding me had consequences now. Quiet ones. Legal ones. Permanent ones. But the real test came months later. Daniel's business hit trouble. A partner backed out. Loans tightened. One evening, he knocked on my door and asked if we could talk. I could see the calculation in his eyes, the memory of how things used to be. This time, I controlled the pace. He asked if I would consider helping. Just temporarily. Just until things stabilized. The old version of me might have said yes immediately, eager to prove usefulness. But that version didn't exist anymore. I told him I would think about it. That night, I sat alone and reflected. Not just on what he'd done, but on what I'd learned. I realized something uncomfortable but freeing. Love without boundaries teaches people how to mistreat you. The next morning, I gave him my answer. I said I would help, but only through clear agreements, written terms, and mutual accountability. His relief was obvious, but so was his surprise. He hadn't expected conditions. If you're listening, ask yourself this. When was the last time you respected someone more after they stopped rescuing you? That was the moment Daniel truly changed. Not when I lost the house. Not when the permit stalled. But when he realized I would no longer sacrifice myself quietly. The house remained full, not of noise, but of balance. And I remained exactly where I belonged. Time has a way of revealing what moments alone cannot. Weeks passed, then months, and the tension that once lived in every corner of the house softened into something quieter, something more honest. Daniel still struggled sometimes. Old habits don't vanish just because the balance of power shifts. But when he slipped, he caught himself. When he spoke too quickly, he corrected his tone. These weren't grand gestures. They were small, awkward adjustments. And those matter more than apologies ever could. I started reclaiming pieces of myself I hadn't realized I'd given away. I resumed my morning walks, greeting neighbors who had quietly wondered where I'd gone. I volunteered twice a week at the library again. I redecorated my room, not to assert dominance, but to remind myself that I was still allowed to shape my surroundings. If you're listening, here's a question you may not want to answer out loud. How much of your life have you shrunk just to keep others comfortable? One afternoon, Daniel's wife sat with me at the kitchen table. She was nervous. I could see it in how she wrapped her fingers around her mug. She told me she hadn't known how things would turn out, that she thought pushing me aside was the practical choice. Practical. Such a cold word for something so personal. I didn't argue with her. I told her something she didn't expect. I said fear makes people cruel faster than hatred ever does. She cried then. Not loudly. Just enough to be real. That conversation didn't make us close, but it made us human to each other. The house began to feel shared again. Not taken. Not borrowed. Shared. But the real shift came when Daniel asked me for advice. Not about money. Not about property. About his marriage. About feeling lost. About pressure. He sat across from me like a son again, not a manager or an owner. I listened. I didn't fix anything for him. I didn't rescue him. I simply listened, and when I spoke carefully. Because wisdom, I've learned, carries more weight when it's offered, not forced. If you're listening closely, this part matters. Power isn't about holding something over someone. It's about no longer being held down by fear. The house didn't change me back into who I was before. It revealed who I had become. Someone quieter, stronger, clearer. Sometimes, late at night, I sit in the living room and think about how close I came to disappearing from my own story. How easy it would have been to accept what happened as inevitable. How many people do exactly that every day? If this story has reached you, maybe it's because you're standing at the edge of something similar. Maybe someone has decided for you that your time is over, your voice too soft, your needs inconvenient. Let me tell you this. As long as you're breathing, your story isn't finished. And sometimes, the moment you stop begging for space is the moment the world makes room. The seasons turned, almost without me noticing. Summer light filled the kitchen earlier each morning, and the garden behind the house began to bloom again. I tended to it slowly, deliberately, as if each weed pulled was a quiet declaration that I was still shaping my future with my own hands. Daniel watched sometimes from the window, and I could tell he was learning something he'd never been taught directly. Stability isn't seized. It's maintained. If you're listening, pause here for a second. Think about the last time you were forced to start over in a place you once felt safe. That disorientation, that ache. It doesn't fade quickly. But it does teach you where your footing truly is. One evening, the neighbors hosted a small gathering. Someone asked casually how long I'd lived in the house. Daniel started to answer, then stopped. He looked at me instead. I told them the truth. Decades. Longer than anyone else there. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was respectful. That moment mattered more than any document we'd signed. Later that night, Daniel thanked me. Not for the land. Not for the help. For staying. He admitted something then, something that felt heavier than any accusation. He said he'd been afraid of becoming irrelevant to me the way he believed I had become to him. Taking the house had been his way of securing permanence, of proving he was in control of something before it slipped away. I didn't excuse him. Understanding isn't the same as forgiveness. But it gave context, and context can soften sharp edges. If you're listening, here's another truth people don't like to say. Hurt people don't always lash out at enemies. Sometimes they strike the safest target in reach. Life settled into a rhythm that felt earned. I cooked when I wanted. I rested when I needed. I spoke when it mattered. And when decisions were made about the house, about finances, about plans, I was part of them, not as a courtesy, but as a constant. There were moments when resentment tried to creep back in. When old memories resurfaced without warning. Healing isn't linear. Anyone who tells you otherwise hasn't done it. But now I didn't swallow those feelings. I named them. Sometimes aloud. Sometimes only to myself. And they lost their power. One afternoon, I found the original photo of my husband tucked into a drawer. I placed it back on the mantel where it belonged. Daniel noticed. He didn't comment. He didn't move it. That quiet respect said everything. If this story has kept you listening, it's probably because you recognize something familiar in it. Maybe you've been underestimated. Maybe someone assumed your chapter was finished. Maybe you were told, without words, to step aside. Remember this. Your worth doesn't expire because someone else needs room. And your strength doesn't always need an audience to be real. I didn't reclaim my house by fighting louder. I reclaimed it by standing still long enough for the truth to catch up. The next winter arrived quietly, with gray skies and frost that traced delicate patterns on the window panes. I spent mornings sitting in my favorite chair, knitting, reading letters from old friends, and occasionally watching Daniel navigate the house with a new awareness. There were no fireworks, no dramatic confrontations. The change was subtle, almost invisible to anyone else, but I could feel it in every corner, every creak of the floorboards, every glance that lingered just a second longer. If you're listening, notice this. Real power is rarely loud. It is quiet. It is unassuming. And it is undeniable. One evening, Daniel came into the kitchen and paused. He didn't speak at first, just watched me chop vegetables with a steady rhythm. Then he said, softly, "I never realized how much this place was yours." The words weren't an apology. They weren't even entirely accurate. But they were acknowledgement. And acknowledgement, in its simplest form, has a power all its own. Months went by. The garden flourished. I hosted small family dinners, this time with Daniel participating, but on my terms. He asked for advice, not instructions. He asked for guidance, not permission. And I gave it, cautiously, deliberately, fully aware that the old dynamics could resurface if I allowed them. But they didn't. Not because I trusted blindly, but because I had learned to assert boundaries quietly, strongly, with calm precision. This is what it means to regain dignity, not by confrontation alone, but by the consistency of presence, by showing that being overlooked no longer equates to being dismissed. Then came a letter in the mail, an unexpected invitation from the city council regarding a grant for home preservation. It was addressed to me, in my name, because I had remained the rightful owner of the land, of the home, of the authority that had always existed quietly in the background. Daniel didn't anticipate this. He didn't see it coming. And, for the first time, he had to sit with the reality that he couldn't fully control what was mine. I read that letter aloud to him, letting each sentence sink in. "You didn't account for this," I said simply. No gloating, no prideful laugh. Just fact. And facts, when presented calmly, often carry more weight than anger ever could. From that day forward, our interactions shifted yet again. He respected my space, my decisions, my voice. Not out of fear, not because of threats, but because he realized I was not the same person who had once trusted without question. If you're listening, here is the most important lesson I want you to carry from my story. Being underestimated can be painful, humiliating even. But it is also the very circumstance that reveals the strength you never knew you had. And that strength, quiet as it may be, can change everything. The final months of that year were quiet but transformative. I settled into routines that were mine alone, not dictated by anyone else. Mornings were filled with tea by the window, watching the sunlight fall across the living room floor. Evenings were for reflection, writing letters to friends and distant relatives, remembering that my life had value beyond the judgments and ambitions of others. I realized something essential: power doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers, waits, and then asserts itself without a sound. Daniel approached me differently now. Not with arrogance, not with entitlement, but with careful respect. He asked questions before acting, sought permission before making decisions, and, for the first time, treated me as an equal rather than an obstacle. He still made mistakes, of course. Old habits die slowly. But I responded with measured calm, correcting him where necessary, asserting my authority without anger, and always keeping my dignity intact. That, I realized, was my true victory. The house itself seemed to breathe differently. I walked through rooms I thought I had lost forever, noting small details, the way sunlight fell on the dining table, the faint scent of my husband's old cologne lingering in the study, the creak of the stairs beneath my feet. These were the things I had fought to protect, and now, having reclaimed them, I understood the power of quiet endurance. My son's actions had tried to erase me, but they had only revealed the depth of my resilience. One evening, Daniel came to me, his expression hesitant. He said, "Mom, I've learned more than I expected." I never realized what I overlooked. I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I watched him, remembering the boy I had raised, the man he had become, and the fragile space between us that had now been restored. I simply nodded. My silence carried more weight than any words could. If you are listening, here's what I want you to remember. Injustice can happen to anyone, even in a place you call home. But strength is not always loud. It is measured in patience, in quiet perseverance, in knowing your worth and standing firm even when others underestimate you. My son took my house, but what I did next, claiming my space, asserting my rights, and refusing to vanish, shocked everyone. Not because of anger, not because of spectacle, but because I reminded them that I was still here. Life returned to a sense of balance. Daniel began to include me in family decisions, consulted me before making changes, and slowly, our relationship healed in ways it never could have if I had reacted with haste or fury. I learned that being underestimated is not a weakness, it is an opportunity. An opportunity to teach, to guide, and to assert oneself with dignity. Now, when I sit in my favorite chair, I see a home restored, a family learning respect, and a life that refuses to be diminished. If you are listening to my story, let it be a reminder. Strength, quiet as it may seem, can overturn assumptions, rewrite wrongs, and reclaim what was always yours. And sometimes, the most powerful moments come not from noise, but from knowing your value and waiting until the world finally acknowledges it.